I think the war certainly did have an impact, but I think it brought to a head things that had been developing for 40 years before. Because in 1870, William Gladstone, as I just mentioned, became Prime Minister, and he was Prime Minister on and off 4 times in his career. Now, Gladstone had been thinking about what he was going to do when he became Prime Minister for a long time before he became Prime Minister. And so he started out with a clear view of what he wanted to do. And what he wanted to do was basically to unify a potentially divided country. He wanted to overcome the kind of Marxist clash between capital and labour, which was a sort of feeling developing within industry and was beginning to impair productivity in industry. So what Gladstone wanted was a railway system that would promote social integration. So he saw railways as being for working class people as well as for businessmen and their managers. He saw the railways as facilities which would allow workers to go on holiday to seaside resorts. So he passed also factory legislation and other legislation which indirectly served to raise the incomes of ordinary workers, to give them obligatory statutory holidays, and he thereby created a low-income market for railway travel that hadn't existed before. And this in turn acted as a financial incentive on the railway companies to pay much more attention to what third-class passengers wanted from the system than before, with their preoccupation on what first-class passengers wanted from the system. At the same time, with freight, there was much more emphasis on supporting industries and local economic development, and also a greater emphasis on signalling and safety and station provision for passengers. Gladstone's package worked because between 1870 and 1914, he bore down quite heavily on the railway companies, obliging them to raise their game. But the fact he was bearing down also on industry and regulating that indirectly created more traffic for the railways. So he was actually giving the railways a new source of profit out of which they could fund the improvements that he wanted to see made. So effectively, when the First World War came, there was already a concept of the social railway. So when the railway got run down, it wasn't really a revolutionary idea to group the companies. It was to some extent a natural evolution of the tendencies that Gladstone himself had promoted through public policy.
Which I think is actually quite an interesting point that you sort of bring up there, that there's when you're just looking at the creating those railways for businessmen and industry, it's normally looking at a very specific thing. I know if I make this railway to here, how much money can we generate in terms of this specific venture? I think often what's sometimes lost in those discussions, and I think is actually potentially a good positive point for actually sort of in terms of nationalising railways, is that there's a lot of peripheral effects that actually can sort of benefit and sort of boost an economy. As you said, having sort of those more broader rail networks just so that working class people could take holidays and things like that expands the market, increases the standard of living for the general public, and also increases spending in a new market as well. So I think in that regards, I think there's maybe some arguments to be made that a privatised or a fully privatised rail industry or rail network maybe wouldn't be as beneficial for the economy as a nationalised one.